Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stand up for those who cannot speak for themselves. In a world where cruelty often wins, one cowboy's simple act of kindness would change everything. In the dusty cattle town of Brimstone, an auction was selling 3 starving wolves to the highest bidder. Most folks saw them as dangerous pests or entertainment for blood sport. But when weathered cowboy Elias Kane stepped forward and declared he'd take them all, the crowd erupted in laughter. They thought he was signing his death warrant. Elias had his reasons, though. Years back, wolves had saved his life during a mountain snowstorm. These 3 broken animals might be the last of that same bloodline. Taking them home would spark fear in his neighbors and rage from fellow ranchers who believed wolves meant dead cattle. What Elias didn't know was that these wolves were being hunted by someone far more dangerous than any wild animal. Would his decision to save them end up destroying everything he'd worked for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the peaks of the granite mountains in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the valley where Elias Kane had made his home. His ranch sat in a natural bowl of grassland, protected by rocky ridges on 3 sides, with a clear stream running through the center. It wasn't much to look at: a modest log cabin with a stone chimney, a weathered barn, and corrals that had seen better years, but it suited a man who valued solitude over society. Elias emerged from the cabin as he did every morning, coffee cup in hand, surveying his small domain with the practiced eye of someone who understood that survival depended on noticing what others missed. At 53, he moved with the careful economy of a man whose body had absorbed decades of hard living. His hair, once black as a raven's wing, now showed silver at the temples, and lines mapped the corners of his eyes, not from age alone, but from squinting into countless sunrises and storms. The wolf-fang necklace rested against his chest, hidden beneath his worn cotton shirt. Most folks in Brimstone had no idea he wore it, and that suited him fine. The ivory tooth, yellowed with age, had belonged to the alpha of the pack, that found him half frozen in a mountain blizzard 15 years ago. They could have left him to die, could have seen him as just another intruder in their territory. Instead, they led him to shelter, stayed with him through 3 days of howling wind and driving snow, sharing their warmth when his fire died. He'd awakened on the 4th morning to find them gone, vanished like spirits into the white wilderness. Only the fang remained, dropped beside his bedroll, a gift he'd never forgotten, and a debt he'd never repaid. The memory lingered as he made his rounds, checking on the handful of cattle that represented his modest livelihood. Brimstone tolerated him because he kept to himself and never caused trouble, but acceptance was a different matter entirely. He was the outsider, the drifter who'd settled where he wasn't particularly wanted, but wasn't unwelcome enough to be run out of town. Doc Henley understood him better than most. The veterinarian was one of the few people in town who'd take time for a real conversation, usually over a game of checkers in the back room of his clinic. They'd served together in different units during the war, and that shared experience created a bond that didn't require many words. "You've got that look again," Doc had said just last week, studying Elias across the checkerboard. "Like you're waiting for something." Maybe I am. Waiting can be dangerous for men like us. Sometimes what we're waiting for isn't what we expect. Martha Webb at the general store treated him with the kind of practical kindness that came from running a business in a frontier town. She didn't pry into his past, didn't question his occasional odd purchases, and always had his supplies ready when he came to town. Her husband had died in a mining accident 3 years back, leaving her to raise 2 children alone, and Elias made sure to buy from her even when he could get things cheaper elsewhere. "You hear about this traveling auction coming through?" She'd mentioned the last time he'd stopped by. "They say it's not just livestock this time." "That's so. Word is, they've got some unusual items, exotic animals, they're calling them." She'd given him a look that suggested she knew more than she was saying. Might draw a different kind of crowd than usual. Sheriff Dalton represented the law in Brimstone, though his authority extended mainly to breaking up saloon fights and mediating disputes over water rights. He was a fair man, if not particularly imaginative, and he'd learned to appreciate Elias's quiet presence in the community. More than once, the rancher's keen eye had spotted signs of trouble before it could take root. "Kane's got good instincts," Dalton had told his deputy. "He sees things others miss." The neighboring ranchers viewed Elias with varying degrees of suspicion and respect. Samuel Morrison, who owned the largest spread in the valley, considered him a useful buffer between his property and the wild country beyond. Others whispered that a man who lived alone with no family ties couldn't be entirely trusted. They noticed how comfortable he seemed in the mountains, how he could track game through terrain that would challenge an Indian scout. They didn't know about the wolf fang, about the debt he carried, about the dreams where he sometimes heard howling in the distance and woke with the strange certainty that something was calling to him across the years. The auction had been announced with handbills posted throughout the territory, promising livestock, equipment, and curiosities from the frontier. Such events drew people from hundreds of miles around, turning sleepy cowtowns into temporary bazaars where anything might change hands for the right price. Elias hadn't planned to attend. Auctions meant crowds, and crowds meant attention he preferred to avoid. But something about Martha's words nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't shake that this particular gathering might offer more than the usual cattle and farm equipment. He'd learned to trust such feelings. They'd kept him alive through the war, helped him survive in country that killed careless men, guided him to this valley where he'd built a quiet life. The instinct that warned of danger also whispered of opportunity, and sometimes the two were inseparable. The evening before the auction, he'd stood on his porch watching the last light fade from the mountain peaks, fingering the wolf fang through his shirt. Somewhere in the darkness, a real wolf howled, the first he'd heard in these parts for over a year. The sound raised the hair on his arms and set something stirring in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than memory. By morning, he'd made his decision. He would go to the auction, not because he needed anything they might be selling, but because 15 years of debt was a heavy burden for any man to carry. He saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness, checked his rifle, and rode toward town with the strange certainty that this day would change everything. The wolf fang bounced against his chest with each step of his horse, a reminder that some debts could only be paid forward, and some calls could not be ignored. The auction yard behind McGillicuddy's tavern buzzed with an energy Elias hadn't seen in Brimstone for years. Wagons filled with curious families lined the dusty street, while serious-eyed men in good suits examined livestock with the calculating stare of professional buyers. But it was the cluster of rough-looking strangers near the back of the crowd that caught his attention, men whose interest clearly lay in something other than cattle or farm equipment. Elias tied his horse to the hitching post and moved through the crowd, his height giving him a clear view over most heads. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Collins who traveled the territorial circuit, was working through the standard offerings: milk cows, breeding bulls, and farm implements that had seen better days. The crowd participated with the familiar rhythm of rural commerce, bidding with subtle nods and raised fingers. Then Collins gestured toward a covered wagon at the far end of the yard, and the atmosphere changed. "Now, folks, we come to the special items I mentioned in the handbills. These next lots require a different kind of buyer, someone with experience handling dangerous animals." A man emerged from behind the wagon, and Elias felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen the type before: predators who dressed themselves up as businessmen, but carried the stench of cruelty like cologne. This one wore a fine coat and polished boots, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who saw living things as commodities. "Allow me to introduce Jeremiah Blackwood," Collins announced. "Mr. Blackwood has brought us some rare specimens captured in the high country. These are not pets, folks. These are genuine mountain wolves, taken alive after considerable effort and expense. The crowd stirred with nervous excitement as workers began removing canvas coverings from 3 sturdy cages. What Elias saw made his blood run cold. The wolves were barely alive, 2 adults and what looked like a juvenile, all 3 reduced to skin and bone, their once magnificent coats matted and dull. The adult male bore fresh wounds across his shoulders, while the female's left ear was torn and infected. The younger wolf, probably not even 2 years old, lay motionless in the corner of its cage, though Elias could see the faint rise and fall of its ribcage. Iron shackles bound their legs, the metal worn smooth from constant struggle. The chains were short enough to prevent them from standing fully upright or lying down comfortably, a deliberate cruelty designed to break their spirits. Dark stains on the cage floors spoke of neglect that went beyond simple captivity. "As you can see," Blackwood called out in a voice that carried the false warmth of a traveling salesman, "these are prime specimens. The male weighs near 120 pounds, or did before we trimmed him down for transport. The female's got good breeding in her lines, and the pup shows promise if it survives the training." Training. Elias's hands clenched into fists. He knew what that meant: blood sport, dog fighting, the kind of entertainment that drew men who found pleasure in watching animals tear each other apart. "Now I know what some of you are thinking," Blackwood continued. "Wolves are dangerous. Wolves kill livestock, but properly handled, these animals can provide years of profitable entertainment. The key is keeping them hungry and angry. That's what makes for a good show." Several men in the crowd nodded approvingly, and Elias recognized the type: bored ranchers looking for new forms of excitement, gamblers always seeking fresh action, and the kind of men who confused cruelty with strength. The bidding started low, with Blackwood clearly disappointed by the lack of enthusiasm. The crowd seemed uncertain about the purchase, perhaps finally grasping the reality of owning half-wild animals. But the rough strangers Elias had noticed earlier began raising the price with steady persistence. $50 for the lot," called one of them, a scarred man whose accent marked him as coming from far south of the territory. "60, replied another, this one wearing the kind of fancy gun rig that suggested he made his living with violence. Elias found himself studying the wolves more closely, looking for something he wasn't sure he'd recognize. The adult male lifted his head slightly, and their eyes met across the noisy yard. For just a moment, the sounds of the crowd faded, and Elias saw something that made his chest tighten with recognition. The wolf's eyes held the same intelligent steadiness he remembered from that mountain cave, the same calm assessment that had marked the alpha who'd saved his life. Not the same animal that had been 15 years ago, but something in the bloodline, the family resemblance that ran deeper than physical features. The bidding had reached $75 when Elias made his decision. 100, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Conversations stopped, heads turned, the crowd's attention focused on the tall rancher who'd just made a bid that everyone knew was far above the animal's value as entertainment. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied this unexpected bidder. "You understand what you're bidding on, friend? These aren't cattle." "I understand perfectly." Samuel Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger. "Kane, what in hell do you think you're doing? You bring those killers into our valley, and every man here will lose stock." 110, called the scarred stranger, clearly annoyed by the interruption. 120. Elias replied without hesitation. More voices joined Morrison's protests. "He's lost his mind. Wolves don't belong in civilization. Sheriff, you need to stop this." Sheriff Dalton looked uncomfortable, but spread his hands helplessly. "It's a legal auction, Sam. Man's got a right to bid." The price climbed steadily, with the strangers clearly determined to acquire the wolves for their own purposes. Elias matched every bid, drawing from savings he'd accumulated over years of careful living. The crowd watched with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a disaster they couldn't prevent. At $200, the strangers finally stopped bidding. The scarred man gave Elias a look that promised future trouble, but stepped back from the auction. Going once at 200, Collins called, sweat beading on his forehead. Going twice, 250. The new voice came from the edge of the crowd, and Blackwood's face lit up with satisfaction. Another of his associates had entered the bidding, someone who'd been waiting for the price to settle before making his move. 300, Elias said quietly. The crowd's murmur rose to an angry buzz. $300 would buy a small herd of cattle or a year's supplies for a family. It was more money than most people in Brimstone saw in 6 months. "You're making a mistake, Kane," Morrison growled. "Those animals will be the death of you, and maybe others too." Elias looked at the wolves again. The female had managed to lift her head, and he saw something in her expression that reminded him of mothers he'd known, protective, desperate, willing to endure anything for the sake of their young. The juvenile wolf was definitely her offspring, and both adults were putting themselves between the crowd and the smaller animal, despite their own weakness. "Going once at 300, Collins announced, his voice cracking slightly. The male wolf's eyes found Elias again, and he saw something that might have been hope, or perhaps just the recognition that passed between predators who understood each other. "Going twice." "I'll take them all," Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. $300, and I'll take them all." The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot, and in the silence that followed, Elias heard someone in the crowd whisper what everyone was thinking. "He's signing his own death warrant." Blackwood approached him as the crowd began to disperse, still muttering about the folly they'd witnessed. "Congratulations, Mr. Kane. I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into." "I reckon I do. These animals have been conditioned for a specific purpose. They may not adjust well to domestication." Elias studied the man's cold smile and understood the threat beneath the words. "They'll adjust fine." As he arranged for transport of the cages to his ranch, Elias caught sight of the scarred stranger watching from across the street. The man touched his hat brim in a mock salute, then melted back into the crowd. The wolves would come home with him, but Elias was beginning to realize that he'd bought more than 3 half-starved animals. He'd stepped into the middle of something larger and more dangerous than a simple auction, and there would be consequences that went far beyond the anger of his neighbors. The iron shackles that bound the wolves seemed to whisper a warning as the cages were loaded onto his wagon. Some chains were harder to break than others. The journey back to his ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional whimper from the caged wolves. Elias had covered the cages with canvas to shield the animals from curious stares, but he could feel their presence like a weight on his conscience. Every bump in the road brought soft sounds of pain that reminded him how close to death he'd brought them home. Doc Henley was waiting when he arrived, having ridden out ahead to prepare. The veterinarian took one look at the covered cages and shook his head. "Elias, please tell me you didn't do what I think you did." "I did what needed doing." They carried the cages into the barn one at a time, and when Doc pulled back the canvas coverings, his weathered face went pale. "Sweet Mary and Joseph, what kind of devil would do this to living creatures?" The wolves lay motionless, too weak to react to their new surroundings. In the better light of the barn, their condition was even worse than Elias had realized. Open sores marked where the shackles had rubbed their legs raw. Their ribs showed clearly through matted fur, and all 3 bore evidence of systematic abuse. "The young one might not make it through the night," Doc said after a quick examination. "Dehydration, malnutrition, and what looks like infected wounds. The adults aren't much better." Elias studied the carved bone whistle that hung from a peg near his workbench, another artifact from his mountain rescue, carved from elk antler by his own hands during the long nights in that cave. The wolves who'd saved him had responded to similar sounds, the low notes that carried meaning in their world. "What do you need to help them?" Doc was already unpacking his bag. "Water first, but they're too weak to drink on their own. We'll need to force fluids, and that means getting close to animals that still have teeth." He glanced at the iron shackles. "Those chains need to come off, but the moment we free them, they'll try to run, and in their condition, running will kill them." or they'll try to fight, which amounts to the same thing. Doc prepared a syringe with practiced efficiency. I can sedate them, but in their weakened state, the drug might finish what their captivity started. Elias made his decision with the same instinct that had guided him through dangerous country for decades. He opened the gate to the male wolf's cage and stepped inside. The animal's eyes opened immediately, fixing on the human who dared to enter his prison. Despite his weakness, the wolf managed to lift his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Elias saw something beyond the threat: intelligence, pride, and the kind of desperate courage that came from protecting family, even when protection seemed impossible. "Easy, old friend," Elias murmured, slowly lowering himself to sit cross-legged just outside the wolf's reach. "I know you don't trust me yet. Can't say I blame you." He pulled the bone whistle from his pocket and played a few soft notes, not a tune, but the kind of sounds he remembered from the mountain cave, the low communications that wolves used among themselves. The animal's ears pricked forward, and the growling stopped. "That's right," Elias continued, setting down a shallow bowl of water. "You know those sounds, don't you? Your grandfather's grandfather might have taught me those." Doc watched in amazement as the wolf stretched his neck toward the water bowl, still watching Elias with wary eyes. "How in blazes? Trust goes both ways," Elias said quietly. "He's deciding whether I'm worth the risk." The wolf lapped a few drops of water, then more, until he'd emptied the small bowl. Elias refilled it twice before the animal finally settled back, still alert but no longer growling. The process repeated with the female, though she proved more suspicious, keeping herself between Elias and the juvenile, even in her weakened state. But hunger and thirst eventually overcame caution, and she too accepted water and small pieces of meat. The young wolf was the greatest challenge. Barely conscious, infections raging through small wounds, he lay motionless, even when Elias entered his cage. But when the bone whistle sounded, his ears twitched, and he managed to open his eyes. "Come on, little fighter," Elias whispered, dipping his fingers in water and letting drops fall onto the wolf's tongue. "You've made it this far." As Doc worked to clean wounds and assess injuries, Elias found himself studying the animals more closely. The resemblance to his mountain rescuers was stronger than he'd first realized, not just in their coloring, but in the way they held themselves, the intelligence in their eyes, even the specific pattern of howls the female used to comfort her offspring. "These aren't just any wolves," he told Doc as they worked. "They're from the same bloodline as the pack that found me in the mountains." "You can't possibly know that." "I know it the same way you know which horse will founder and which will run forever. Some things you recognize in the bones." Outside, the sun was setting when Sheriff Dalton rode up to the barn. He dismounted slowly, his face showing the strain of a difficult day. "Elias, I've got half the valley wanting me to arrest you for endangering the community." "On what charge?" "Reckless endangerment, disturbing the peace. Take your pick. Sam Morrison's talking about organizing the ranchers to demand you get rid of those animals." Elias continued working on the young wolf's infected ear. "They're on my property, causing no trouble to anyone." "They're wolves, Elias. That's trouble enough for most folks." Dalton moved closer to the cages, studying their occupants. "Sweet Jesus. What happened to them?" "Same thing that happens to anything that falls into the wrong hands." Doc looked up from bandaging the female's leg. "Sheriff, these animals are too weak to threaten a rabbit, much less anyone's livestock. Give them a chance to heal before you start planning their execution." Dalton rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I can keep the peace for now, but Morrison's stirring up real anger. People are scared, Elias. Scared people do stupid things." After the sheriff left, Elias and Doc worked into the night, cleaning wounds, administering medicine, and coaxing the wolves to take nourishment. The bone whistle became their key to communication, the soft notes seeming to calm the animals and make them more receptive to human touch. "I've never seen anything like it," Doc admitted, as they prepared to leave the barn. "It's almost like they recognize you." Elias fingered the wolf fang through his shirt. "Maybe they do. The young wolf was the last one they tended, and as Elias prepared to leave the cage, the animal did something that stopped him cold. Despite his obvious pain and weakness, the wolf struggled to lift his head and touched his nose to Elias's outstretched hand, the same gesture of acceptance he'd witnessed in the mountain cave 15 years before. "I'll be back in the morning," Elias promised. "All of you just need to hold on." As they walked toward the house, Doc glanced back at the barn, where 3 broken animals were fighting for their lives. "You know, this won't end with healing them. Blackwood and his associates won't just walk away from a $300 investment." "I know. And Morrison's not going to stop agitating the other ranchers. They see you as choosing wolves over your neighbors." "Maybe I am." Doc paused at his horse. "Why, Elias? I know you've got your reasons, but this could destroy everything you've built here." Elias looked toward the mountains, where moonlight painted the peaks silver. Somewhere in that wilderness, the descendants of his rescuers might still run free. But these 3 in his barn represented something more than just animals. They were the living proof that debts could be repaid, that kindness could flow both ways, that some connections transcended the boundaries between species. 15 years ago, I was dying in those mountains," he said quietly. "Wolves I'd never met saved my life, asked nothing in return, and disappeared like they were never there. I've carried that debt ever since." "And you think these 3 are the same wolves?" "I think they're family, and family takes care of family." The bone whistle felt warm in his pocket as he watched Doc ride away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new decisions. But tonight, 3 wolves were alive who hadn't been that morning, and sometimes that was enough to build a hope on. Dawn came grey and cold, with frost painting the grass silver and mist rising from the stream that cut through Elias's property. He'd spent a restless night listening for sounds from the barn, torn between the need to check on his new charges and the knowledge that too much human attention might undo the fragile trust they'd begun to build. The smell of wood smoke and coffee couldn't quite mask his anxiety as he made his morning rounds, checking on cattle that seemed skittish and alert. Animals sense things humans missed, and the presence of wolves, even caged, wounded ones, had set the entire ranch on edge. When he finally entered the barn, Elias felt a surge of relief. All 3 wolves were awake and alert, their eyes tracking his movement as he approached their cages. The young wolf had managed to stand during the night, and though he swayed on unsteady legs, the simple act of remaining upright marked a significant improvement. "Morning, friends," Elias said softly, producing the bone whistle. The low notes seemed to settle the animals, and he noticed how the female's ears pricked forward in what might have been recognition. A leather medicine pouch sat on his workbench, another remnant from his mountain experience, filled with herbs and remedies he'd learned from an old trapper who taught him that sometimes the best healing came from the wilderness itself. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, and dried meat processed in the old way that would be easier for weakened stomachs to digest. He was mixing a healing paste when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Through the barn window, he saw Samuel Morrison riding up with 3 other ranchers, their faces set in the grim expressions of men who'd come to deliver an ultimatum. Elias stepped outside to meet them, closing the barn door behind him. "Morning, Sam." "Tom." "Jake." Morrison dismounted but stayed near his horse, as if expecting to need a quick escape. "Elias, we've come to talk sense into you before this situation gets out of hand." "What situation would that be?" "Don't play games with us," Tom Brennan interjected. He owned the spread downstream from Elias and had always been quick to anger. "You know damn well what having wolves in the valley means." Jake Rawlings, the youngest of the group, seemed less certain but unwilling to back down in front of his elders. "My wife's scared to let the children play outside. The whole community's on edge." Elias studied their faces, seeing fear mixed with frustration and something else, the kind of anger that came from feeling helpless against forces they couldn't control. "Those wolves are barely alive, Jake. They couldn't threaten a house cat, much less your children." "But they'll get stronger," Morrison said, And then what? You planning to keep wild predators on a cattle ranch? I'm planning to help 3 suffering animals recover from torture. Torture? Brennan's voice rose. They're wolves, Elias. They don't feel pain the way we do. The ignorance in that statement made Elias's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. Every living thing feels pain, Tom. The question is whether we add to it or try to ease it. Morrison stepped forward, lowering his voice in an attempt at reasoned persuasion. Look, we understand you paid good money for them. We're prepared to help you recoup that loss. Sell them to someone who knows how to handle dangerous animals properly. Like Blackwood? If necessary, the point is getting them away from here before someone gets hurt. From inside the barn came a soft, whimpering sound, the young wolf calling to his mother. The female answered with a low whine that spoke of comfort and protection, the kind of sound that transcended species barriers. Those animals have been through hell, Elias said quietly. They've been beaten, starved and shackled like criminals. All they're asking for is a chance to heal. They're not asking for anything, Brennan snapped. They're animals. The leather medicine pouch felt heavy in Elias's hand as he considered how to explain something that went beyond logic into the realm of understanding that came from shared suffering. These men saw only the threat, not the intelligence, not the family bonds, not the courage that kept the adult wolves fighting for their offspring's survival. I've made my decision, he said finally. They stay. Morrison's face darkened. Then you're choosing them over your neighbors, over the safety of our families. I'm choosing to honor a debt. What debt could you possibly owe to wild animals? The wolf fang necklace seemed to burn against Elias's chest, but he wasn't ready to share that story. Some experiences were too personal, too sacred to be laid out for men who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss. That's my business, Sam. The ranchers exchanged glances, and Elias saw the moment when persuasion shifted toward something harder. This isn't over, Elias, Morrison said as they mounted their horses. The whole valley's watching. If anything happens, if anyone gets hurt because of those animals, it's on your head. After they rode away, Elias returned to the barn, where the wolves had clearly sensed the tension of the confrontation. The male was standing now, weak but alert, his eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting trouble. The female had positioned herself to protect the young wolf, and all 3 watched Elias with the wary intelligence of creatures who understood that their fate hung in the balance. He opened the leather pouch and began mixing the healing paste, adding ingredients while humming the low notes that seemed to calm them. The work required patience, the kind of methodical care that came from understanding that healing couldn't be rushed. I know you're scared, he said as he worked. New place, new smells, humans who might mean harm. But you're safe here. I give you my word on that. The bone whistle produced a soft melody that seemed to capture something of the mountain wind, and the wolves visibly relaxed. The female even lay down, though she kept her eyes on Elias as he prepared their morning meal. It was then that he noticed something that made his breath catch. The female's left front paw bore a distinctive white marking, 3 toes with white fur in a pattern he'd seen before. In the mountain cave, 15 years ago, one of his rescuers had carried the same marking, not the same animal, but the genetic signature that marked bloodlines as clearly as any family name. The connection was real. These wolves were descendants of the pack that had saved his life, and somehow they'd found their way to him across years and miles and impossible odds. The debt he'd carried for so long could finally be repaid. But as he worked to clean their wounds and coax them to eat, Elias understood that the healing process would test more than their physical strength. The community's fear was real. Morrison's anger was growing, and somewhere out there, Blackwood and his associates were probably planning to reclaim their investment. The leather pouch held medicines for the body, but the challenges ahead would require healing of a different sort, the kind that bridged the gap between human and animal, between debt and redemption, between the wilderness that had shaped him and the civilization he'd tried to join. The young wolf managed to eat a small portion of meat, and when he settled back down beside his mother, Elias heard something he hadn't expected, a soft, rumbling sound that might have been contentment. It was a small victory, but in a battle for survival, small victories were what kept hope alive. Outside, storm clouds were building over the mountains, promising weather that would test everyone's resolve. But inside the barn, 3 wolves were growing stronger by the hour, and a man who'd carried a 15-year debt was finally learning what it meant to pay it forward. The storm hit 3 days later, with a ferocity that reminded everyone why frontier life required constant vigilance. Wind howled across the valley like a living thing, driving rain horizontal against the barn walls and turning the normally placid stream into a roaring torrent. But inside the sturdy log structure, the wolves were showing remarkable improvement. A silver compass hung from a nail near the barn entrance, another artifact from Elias's past, this one inherited from his father, who'd used it to navigate wagon trains across the Oregon Trail. The compass pointed true north regardless of storms, and Elias had learned to trust that kind of unwavering direction when everything else seemed uncertain. The male wolf, whom Elias had begun thinking of as Storm for his grey-silver coat, was now standing for extended periods and taking solid food. His wounds were healing cleanly, and the intelligent alertness in his yellow eyes suggested a mind that was cataloguing everything about his new environment. More importantly, Storm had begun responding to the bone whistle with soft whines of his own, a tentative communication that spoke of growing trust. The female moon, for the pale crescents that marked her dark fur, remained more cautious, but had started moving around her cage, testing her strength and assessing the security of their shelter. She watched Elias with the calculating gaze of a mother who'd seen too much cruelty to trust easily. But her defensive posturing had given way to something that resembled cautious curiosity. The young wolf, barely more than a pup despite his size, had surprised everyone with his resilience. Doc Henley had predicted the little one wouldn't survive the first week, but the animal they'd started calling Scout had not only survived, but was showing flashes of the playful energy that marked healthy young wolves. His appetite had returned, and he'd begun the tentative exploration that suggested his spirit remained unbroken despite everything he'd endured. "They're remarkable," Doc observed during one of his visits, watching Scout attempt to play with a stick that had fallen into his cage. "I've treated wolves before, but never ones that seemed so aware." Elias nodded, remembering how the mountain pack had displayed that same heightened intelligence, the ability to assess situations and make complex decisions that went beyond mere animal instinct. Some bloodlines carry more than just physical traits. The improvement in the wolves' condition was evident, but their presence on the ranch had created complications that extended far beyond the valley's borders. Word had spread through the territory's network of saloons, trading posts, and mail stations, drawing attention from people whose interest in the animals had nothing to do with their welfare. Martha Webb had mentioned seeing strangers in town, men who asked too many questions about Elias's ranch and showed particular interest in directions to his property. Sheriff Dalton had noticed unfamiliar horses tied outside the saloon, and their riders bore the hard look of men who made their living through violence. "Blackwood's not giving up," Doc warned as he packed his medical bag after examining the wolves. "A man doesn't invest in animals like these just to walk away from a loss." Elias had been thinking the same thing. The silver compass needle held steady despite the storm raging outside, but human intentions were harder to read than magnetic north. "He'll make his move when he thinks I'm vulnerable. Are you prepared for that?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Elias had spent years building a peaceful life, avoiding the kind of conflicts that had marked his younger days. But the wolves represented something that went deeper than property or money. They were living links to a debt that had shaped everything he'd become. "I'll do what needs doing." That evening, as the storm continued to batter the ranch, Elias made a decision that would change everything. He opened Storm's cage. The big wolf froze, amber eyes fixed on the open door with an intensity that suggested he was calculating the distance to freedom. For several heartbeats, neither man nor animal moved. Then Storm took a tentative step forward, testing whether this was some kind of trap. "You're not a prisoner," Elias said quietly, the bone whistle producing soft notes that seemed to echo the storm's rhythm. "Never were. You're guests, and guests can leave whenever they choose." Storm approached the cage entrance cautiously, his powerful frame coiled for instant flight. When he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back at Moon and Scout, some silent communication passing between the three animals. Then he stepped out into the barn's open space. The wolf stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply and taking in scents that weren't filtered through metal bars. His legs trembled slightly, whether from lingering weakness or the emotional impact of freedom. Elias couldn't tell. But when Storm looked at him, there was something new in those yellow eyes. Not gratitude, exactly, but a recognition that this human understood something most of his species did not. One by one, Elias opened the other cages. Moon emerged with regal dignity, immediately moving to Scout's side as the young wolf tentatively explored his expanded world. They were still confined to the barn, but the removal of the cages represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. The silver compass gleamed in the lamplight, its needle holding steady despite the chaos outside. Some directions never changed, no matter how violent, the storms that tried to shake them. And as Elias watched three wolves explore their new freedom, he understood that he'd chosen his direction long ago, in a mountain cave where kindness had flowed between species without expectation of reward. But freedom brought new responsibilities. The wolves were stronger now, capable of movement that could take them far from the safety of the barn. If they chose to leave, to return to the wild country that was their true home, he wouldn't stop them. The debt would be paid simply by giving them that choice. Storm seemed to sense his thoughts. The big wolf approached slowly, and when he was close enough, he did something that made Elias's throat tighten with emotion. Storm pressed his nose against the man's outstretched hand, the same gesture of acceptance that his ancestors had offered in a cave 15 years before. The connection was complete. Past and present, debt and redemption, the wild and the civilized, all of it contained in the simple touch between species that had learned to trust each other despite everything the world had done to make such trust impossible. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the barn, a different kind of weather was clearing. The wolves were healing, growing stronger, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. And Elias Kane, who had carried the weight of unpaid debt for 15 years, finally understood what it meant to find his true north in the midst of a storm. The morning after the storm brought an uneasy calm that made Elias more nervous than the wind and rain had. In his experience, the most dangerous moments often came when everything appeared peaceful, when a man might let his guard down just long enough for trouble to find him. He'd spent the night in the barn, sleeping on a bedroll near the stall where he kept his tack. The wolves had accepted his presence with remarkable composure, settling into a routine that seemed almost domestic despite their wild nature. Storm had claimed the corner nearest the door, positioning himself where he could watch for threats. Moon had chosen a spot that allowed her to keep Scout between herself and any potential danger. Even in their improved condition, survival instincts ran deep. A brass locket lay on the workbench, the final artifact from his mountain rescue, containing a photograph of his late wife, Sarah. She'd understood his need to live on the edge of civilization, had even encouraged his move to the territory after the war. Some souls need space to breathe, she'd told him before the fever took her. The wolves seemed to carry that same understanding, accepting human kindness while maintaining their essential wildness. Doc Henley arrived before noon, riding up with the cautious manner of a man who'd heard troubling rumors. "Elias, we need to talk." They stepped outside where they could speak freely without disturbing the animals. Doc's face carried the grim expression that came from delivering bad news to people he cared about. Blackwood's been asking questions around town, specific questions about your routine, your property, and most particularly about the best approaches to your ranch. How specific? Specific enough that Sheriff Dalton's starting to worry. The man's not just planning to buy his animals back, Elias. He's planning to take them. Elias had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the threat real in a way that planning couldn't quite capture. When? Soon, if Martha's right about the men she's been seeing. They're not trying to hide their presence anymore, which usually means they're ready to act. They walked toward the barn, where the sounds of the wolves moving around suggested they were continuing to regain strength. The improvement in their condition was remarkable, but it also made them more valuable to men who saw living creatures as investments to be protected. There's something else, Doc continued. Sam Morrison's been talking to the other ranchers about taking direct action. He's convinced that keeping those wolves is going to bring down trouble on the whole valley. Sam might be right about that, but you're not planning to give them up. Elias touched the brass locket through his shirt, feeling the weight of memories that shaped his decisions. Sarah would have understood his choice, would have supported his need to honor the debt that had defined so much of his life. Can't do it, Doc. These animals deserve better than what they've gotten so far. Inside the barn, they found the wolves had arranged themselves in a way that suggested growing comfort with their environment. Scout was actually playing, pouncing on shadows and chasing dust motes in the morning sunlight that streamed through the windows. Moon watched her offspring with the kind of maternal attention that transcended species, while Storm maintained his vigilant guard position. They're remarkable, Doc observed, watching the family dynamics play out. I've never seen wild animals adapt to captivity so well. They're not in captivity anymore, Elias replied, gesturing toward the open cages. They're choosing to stay. The distinction mattered more than Doc could understand. The wolves remained in the barn because they wanted to be there, because they felt safe and were healing from injuries that went deeper than physical wounds. But they could leave at any time, could return to the wild country that called to their deepest instincts. Storm approached them as they talked, moving with increasing confidence and strength. The big wolf studied Doc with intelligent eyes, seeming to assess whether this new human represented a threat or an ally. When Doc extended his hand slowly, Storm sniffed carefully before touching his nose to the veterinarian's palm. He's accepting you, Elias said with satisfaction. That's not something that happens easily. How can you tell? Watch his ears, his posture. He's curious, not defensive. He's deciding you might be worth trusting. Moon joined them, moving with the fluid grace that marked her kind at their finest. Her wounds had healed to the point where only careful examination revealed the scars of her captivity, and her coat was beginning to show the lustrous health that proper food and care could restore. When she looked at Elias, he saw something that might have been gratitude, though he suspected it was more complex than that simple word could capture. They're going to be magnificent when they're fully recovered, Doc said admiringly. They already are. A grade 7D. Scout bounded over to investigate the visitors, displaying the fearless curiosity of youth, combined with the growing wisdom that came from surviving trauma. The young wolf had filled out considerably, his coat showing the rich coloring that marked his bloodline, and his movements carried the promise of the powerful animal he would become. The resemblance is uncanny, Doc murmured, watching Scout play. If I didn't know better, I'd swear I'd seen these exact animals before. Maybe you have, in a way. Elias produced the bone whistle and played a few soft notes. All three wolves responded immediately, their ears pricking forward and their attention focusing on the sound with an intensity that suggested deep recognition. That melody, where did you learn it? From their family. 15 years ago. Doc's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The mountain rescue, the pack that saved your life. These are their descendants. Has to be. The bloodline's too distinct. The response is too specific for coincidence. The brass locket felt warm against Elias's chest as he watched the wolves interact with their environment. Sarah had always believed that some connections transcended the boundaries of species, time, and circumstance. Love finds a way, she'd told him once, even when logic says it's impossible. A sound from outside interrupted his reverie, horses approaching at a steady pace. Through the barn window, he saw Sheriff Dalton riding up with two men Elias didn't recognize. The sheriff's posture suggested official business, and the strangers carried themselves with the careful alertness of men accustomed to trouble. "Stay here," Elias told Doc, moving toward the barn door. The wolves had heard the horses too, and all three had moved to defensive positions, their earlier playfulness replaced by the wariness that had kept their species alive for millennia. Dalton dismounted slowly, his face showing the strain of a man caught between competing responsibilities. "Elias, these gentlemen have some questions about your recent purchases." The strangers wore badges that marked them as territorial marshals, but their presence felt more like enforcement than law. The older of the two stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his gun. "Mr. Kane, I'm Marshal Garrett. We've had complaints about dangerous animals being kept in violation of territorial statutes." "What statutes would those be?" "The ones concerning wild predators in proximity to settled communities." Garrett's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his words accepted without question. "We're here to conduct an inspection and determine whether those animals pose a threat to public safety." Elias understood the real message beneath the official language. Someone with enough influence had decided the wolves needed to be removed, and they'd found legal justification for doing so. The brass locket seemed to pulse against his chest, reminding him that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. "The animals are on my property, causing no trouble to anyone." "That remains to be determined," Garrett replied. "We'll need to see them now." The moment of decision had arrived sooner than expected, but Elias had been preparing for it since the day he'd made his bid at the auction. Some debts could only be paid with courage, and some stands had to be made regardless of the consequences. The wolves were depending on him now, just as he'd once depended on their ancestors. The circle was closing, and everything would be decided by how well he'd learned the lessons that survival had taught him over the years. The inspection proceeded with the cold formality of men who'd already reached their conclusions before gathering evidence. Marshal Garrett and his companion, who introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Pierce, examined the wolves with the calculating assessment of livestock evaluators rather than law enforcement officials. A folded letter rested in Elias's shirt pocket, something that had arrived with the morning mail and changed everything he thought he understood about his situation. The letter bore an official seal from the territorial government, but its contents revealed a truth that ran deeper than any legal authority. "These animals appear healthy enough," Garrett observed, making notes on an official-looking form. "Too healthy, in fact, for creatures that were reportedly near death just weeks ago. Good care and proper feeding work miracles," Doc interjected, his veterinarian's pride overriding his caution. Pierce circled the wolves with the predatory awareness of someone who understood violence. "They're certainly large enough to pose a threat. That male must weigh close to 130 pounds now." Storm watched the strangers with intelligent wariness, positioning himself to protect Moon and Scout while maintaining a clear path to the barn's rear exit. The big wolf's assessment of potential threats was proving as accurate as Elias's own combat instincts. "Mr. Kane," Garrett said, completing his circuit of the barn, "I'm afraid these animals represent an unacceptable risk to the community. We'll need you to make arrangements for their removal within 48 hours. Removal to where? That's not our concern. Sell them, donate them to a traveling show, put them down humanely. The method is your choice. But they cannot remain here." It was then that Elias made his decision to reveal what he'd learned from the morning's mail. He pulled the folded letter from his pocket, its official seal catching the light that streamed through the barn windows. "Before you finish writing your report, Marshal, you might want to read this." Garrett accepted the letter with obvious reluctance, his confidence faltering as he recognized the territorial seal. As he read, his face went through a series of expressions that told Elias everything he needed to know about the true nature of this inspection. "Where did you get this?" Garrett demanded, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. "From the Territorial Wildlife Commission. Seems they've been investigating reports of illegal animal trafficking in this region." Elias kept his voice level, letting the facts speak for themselves. "According to their investigation, someone's been capturing protected wildlife and selling it to buyers who use the animals for blood sport." Doc moved closer, curious about this development that Elias hadn't mentioned earlier. "What kind of investigation?" "The kind that's been tracking Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood's activities for the better part of a year," Elias replied, watching Garrett's face carefully. "Turns out there are federal laws about trafficking in protected species, and wolves fall under those protections in this territory." Pierce had stopped taking notes, his attention now focused on something outside the barn. Through the window, Elias could see riders approaching, not the casual pace of neighbors or the official dignity of lawmen, but the purposeful movement of men with specific intentions. The letter also mentions that the commission has been looking for these specific animals. Elias continued, his hand drifting toward the rifle that hung on the barn wall. "Seems they were taken from a protected area, which makes their capture a federal offense." Garrett's face had gone pale as he absorbed the implications. "You're saying these marshals' badges are probably as fake as your inspection. Real marshals would have known about the federal investigation." The sound of multiple horses stopping outside confirmed Elias's suspicions. Through the window, he could see Blackwood dismounting, along with several hard-looking men whose presence explained everything about this supposed official visit. "Doc," Elias said quietly, "you might want to step behind that feed bin." The wolves had sensed the change in atmosphere, their posture shifting from cautious observation to active alertness. Storm's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, while Moon moved to shield Scout with her body. All three animals seemed to understand that the real threat had finally arrived. "Mr. Kane," came Blackwood's voice from outside the barn, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Elias moved toward the barn door, his rifle now in his hands. "Those animals don't belong to anyone anymore, Blackwood. They're under federal protection." "Federal protection?" Blackwood's laugh carried genuine amusement. "You really think some paper from a territorial office is going to change anything? Those wolves represent a significant investment, and I intend to recover that investment one way or another." The folded letter in Elias's pocket contained more than just information about wildlife protection. It also included a personal note from the Commission's chief investigator, a man named Colonel James Morrison, who'd served in the same unit as Elias during the war and who'd been tracking Blackwood's operation as part of a larger investigation into organized animal trafficking. "The thing is, Blackwood," Elias called through the partially open door, "those fake marshals of yours just gave me enough evidence to connect you directly to illegal trafficking. That makes this a federal case, and federal cases tend to attract federal attention." A shot rang out, splintering the wood near Elias's head. The negotiation phase was over. "Storm, Moon, Scout," Elias said urgently, using the names he'd given them but speaking in the tone that commanded immediate attention. "Back door, now." The wolves understood, moving with fluid speed toward the rear exit that Elias had always kept clear for exactly this kind of situation. But Storm paused at the threshold, looking back with an expression that seemed to ask whether the human would be following. "Go," Elias urged. "Find the high country. Find your people." Storm's amber eyes held his for one more moment, some communication passing between them that transcended species. Then the big wolf was gone, leading his family toward freedom, while the man who'd saved them prepared to hold off the hunters who'd pursued them across hundreds of miles. The brass locket pressed against Elias's chest as he took position behind an overturned feed trough. Sarah had always understood that some stands had to be made, regardless of the cost, and some debts could only be paid with everything a person had to give. The wolves were free. The debt was paid. Everything else was just the settling of accounts that had been 15 years in the making. The barn erupted into chaos as Blackwood's men spread out to surround the building. Elias counted at least 6 voices outside, maybe more, all of them coordinating with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this kind of work before. The fake marshals had drawn their weapons, revealing themselves as hired guns rather than law enforcement. A worn leather holster hung on a peg near his workbench, his father's cavalry holster from the Mexican War, complete with a heavy Colt revolver that had seen action from Santa Fe to the Oregon Territory. Elias had hoped never to wear it again, but some situations demanded the tools that civilized men preferred to forget. "Doc, stay down and stay quiet," he whispered, settling the gun belt around his waist with movements made automatic by years of practice. "This is going to get loud." Doc Henley crouched behind the feed bin, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. "How many of them are out there?" "Too many for conversation. Not enough to worry about if we're smart." Elias checked his rifle's load with the mechanical precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such details. "Question is whether they want the wolves badly enough to risk a real fight." The answer came in the form of another shot, this one punching through the barn wall and embedding itself in a support post inches from Doc's head. Blackwood wasn't interested in negotiation. "Kane!" Blackwood's voice carried the frustrated anger of a man whose careful plans had been disrupted. "You've cost me time, money, and reputation. I'm prepared to be reasonable about this, but my patience has limits. So does mine." Elias called back, positioning himself where he could see multiple approaches to the barn. "Your wolves are gone, Blackwood. Head back to wherever you came from and find a new line of work. Those animals represent months of planning and considerable expense. They're trained for a specific purpose, and my buyers are expecting delivery." Elias felt his jaw tighten at the casual way Blackwood discussed the wolves' suffering. The bone whistle in his pocket seemed to grow warm, reminding him of the intelligence he'd seen in Storm's eyes. The protective devotion Moon showed toward Scout, the playful spirit that the young wolf had maintained despite everything he'd endured. "Your buyers are going to be disappointed." A new voice joined the conversation, Sheriff Dalton, arriving with what sounded like several horses. "What in hell is going on here?" "Blackwood, I told you to stay out of my jurisdiction." "Sheriff, thank goodness you're here," Garrett called out, still maintaining his pretense of being a legitimate lawman. "We're attempting to serve a legal warrant, and this man has opened fire on federal officers." But Dalton had been a peace officer long enough to recognize the sound of lies wrapped in official language. "Federal officers don't usually travel with private armies, Marshal, and they sure don't conduct business with men like Blackwood." The situation was becoming more complex by the minute, with multiple groups of armed men facing off around his barn. Elias could hear movement in several directions, voices he didn't recognize joining the confrontation. Whatever had started as Blackwood's private recovery operation was turning into something much larger. "Elias," came another familiar voice. "This is Sam Morrison. We're here to help." Through a gap in the barn wall, Elias could see the ranchers from the valley spreading out in positions that flanked Blackwood's men. Morrison carried his old Spencer rifle, while Tom Brennan and Jake Rawlings had taken cover behind a watering trough with clear fields of fire. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same neighbors who demanded he get rid of the wolves were now risking their lives to protect his right to keep them. But that was the frontier way. You might disagree with a man's choices, but you stood with him when outsiders brought trouble to your valley. "Appreciate it, Sam," Elias called back, his voice carrying across the increasingly crowded barnyard. "But this isn't your fight." "Hell, it isn't. Blackwood and his boys have been asking too many questions, making too many threats. This valley takes care of its own problems." The leather holster felt familiar against Elias's hip, awakening memories of other battles in other places, where the difference between right and wrong had been measured in gunpowder and determination. He'd hoped those days were behind him, but some conflicts followed a man, no matter how far he traveled or how peacefully he tried to live. Doc was fumbling with something in his medical bag, a small derringer that looked almost comical in his weathered hands. "I'm not much of a fighter, Elias, but I didn't spend 4 years patching up soldiers just to watch good men get murdered by hired killers. Stay behind cover, Doc. Let the rifle do the talking if it comes to that." But Elias was calculating odds and distances with the cold assessment that had once made him valuable to military commanders who needed impossible missions accomplished. 6 or 7 of Blackwood's men, plus the fake marshals. 4 ranchers, led by Morrison, Sheriff Dalton, and possibly a deputy, Doc with his derringer, and himself with a rifle, and the Colt that had never failed him when everything depended on accuracy and speed. The numbers weren't terrible, but numbers told only part of the story. Blackwood's men were professionals, paid killers who made their living with violence. The ranchers were brave but mostly inexperienced in this kind of fighting, and Dalton was a peace officer who'd probably never drawn his weapon in anger. A sound from the rear of the barn caught his attention, not the wolves returning, but something else moving in the brush behind the building. Elias worked his way toward the back door, rifle ready, expecting to find more of Blackwood's men attempting to flank the building. Instead, he found Colonel James Morrison crouched in the undergrowth with 3 men wearing the distinctive badges of federal marshals. Real ones this time, if their disciplined positioning and military bearing were any indication. "Hello, Elias," the colonel said quietly. "Thought you might need some backup." "Jim, what are you doing here?" "Following a trail that's led us halfway across the territory. Blackwood's operation is bigger than just animal trafficking. We've connected him to illegal weapons sales, territorial claim jumping, and at least 3 unsolved murders." Morrison checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Those wolves of yours were the bait we needed to draw him into the open." The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. "You used them as bait?" "We used the situation. The animals were already in danger, already being hunted. All we did was make sure they had someone to protect them while we gathered the evidence we needed." Elias felt the weight of manipulation, of being maneuvered by forces he hadn't fully understood. But looking at the federal marshals preparing for action, he also saw justice finally catching up with men who'd built their fortunes on cruelty and violence. "The wolves are safe in the high country, probably halfway to Canada by now, if they're as smart as you think they are." Morrison's smile held genuine warmth. "You did good, Elias. Those animals have a chance now." The brass locket seemed to pulse against his chest as Elias understood that the debt he'd carried for 15 years had become part of something larger, a web of justice and retribution that extended far beyond one man's obligation to the creatures that had saved his life. "Ready to finish this?" Morrison asked, gesturing toward the front of the barn, where voices were rising in anger and impatience. Elias Kane, who'd spent years trying to build a quiet life on the edges of civilization, nodded grimly and prepared to step back into the world of violence he'd tried so hard to leave behind. But this time, he wasn't fighting for territory or politics or the abstract ideals that had driven so many wars. This time, he was fighting for something that mattered. The confrontation exploded into violence with the sudden fury of a mountain storm. Blackwood's patience finally snapped when he realized the wolves had escaped, and his shouted order to "take Kane alive but kill anyone who gets in the way" shattered the tense standoff that had held everyone in check. Elias moved with the fluid economy of motion that combat veterans never entirely lose, rolling behind a hay bale as bullets splintered the wood where he'd been standing. The worn leather holster released his father's Colt with practiced ease, the heavy revolver settling into his hand like it belonged there. The first exchange of gunfire was brief but decisive. Sheriff Dalton's deputy went down with a bullet in his shoulder, while one of Blackwood's men stumbled backward, clutching a shattered wrist. Doc Henley, crouched behind the feed bin with his derringer, proved that medical training included knowing exactly where to place a shot for maximum effect. "Federal marshals," Colonel Morrison's voice boomed across the barnyard as he and his men emerged from their concealment. "Throw down your weapons!" But Blackwood was beyond the reach of legal authority now. His careful plans dissolved into the kind of desperate violence that left men with only two choices: victory or death. "Kill them all!" he screamed, his cultured facade finally cracking to reveal the savage beneath. The battle fragmented into individual duels, fought across the confined space of the barnyard. Elias found himself facing the fake Marshal Garrett, who'd produced a sawed-off shotgun from beneath his coat and was advancing with the grim determination of someone who knew capture meant a federal gallows. The Colt bucked in Elias's hand, its heavy .44 caliber bullet catching Garrett's center mass and spinning him around like a child's toy. But the man stayed on his feet, raising the shotgun with blood streaming down his shirt front, and Elias had to dive sideways to avoid the blast that shredded the air where his head had been. Sam Morrison and his ranchers were giving better than they received, their knowledge of the terrain allowing them to use every bit of cover, while Blackwood's hired guns found themselves exposed in open ground. Tom Brennan's Spencer rifle spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastating in its effect. But it was Jake Rawlings who surprised everyone. The youngest and supposedly least experienced of the ranchers had positioned himself where he could see the entire battlefield, and his Winchester was picking off targets with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned to shoot by putting meat on the family table. "Behind you, Elias!" Doc's warning came just in time to alert him to Deputy Marshal Pierce, who'd circled around the barn and was drawing a bead on his back. Elias spun and fired in one motion, the bullet taking Pierce high in the chest and dropping him like a stone. Colonel Morrison and his federal marshals were advancing steadily, their military training evident in the way they moved and fought as a coordinated unit. But Blackwood's men were professionals too, and they'd chosen their positions well before the shooting started. The battle was reaching its crescendo when Elias heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the distinctive howl of wolves, coming from the direction of the high country. Not distress calls, but the territorial announcements that marked pack movements, the complex communications that spoke of family groups on the hunt. Storm, Moon, and Scout hadn't fled to safety as he'd hoped. They'd gone to gather reinforcements. The howling grew closer, more voices joining the chorus, until the entire valley seemed to echo with the ancient music of the pack. Blackwood's men began looking over their shoulders, their professional composure shaken by sounds that awakened primal fears buried deep in human consciousness. "What in hell?" one of the gunmen started to say, just before Storm materialized out of the underbrush like a grey shadow made flesh. The big wolf had returned, but he hadn't come alone. Behind him moved shapes that spoke of the deep wilderness, the hidden places where wolf packs still ran free, despite everything civilization had done to drive them out. Not just Moon and Scout, but others, adults with the scars of survival, juveniles learning the lessons of pack cooperation, elders whose amber eyes held the wisdom of countless hunts. Blackwood's careful plans dissolved into chaos as his men found themselves facing an enemy they'd never trained to fight. Wolves moved differently than humans, attacked from unexpected angles, used pack tactics that turned individual strength into collective power. The animals didn't kill, they didn't need to. They simply appeared where gunmen expected safety, vanished when weapons turned their way, and created the kind of psychological pressure that broke men's nerve faster than bullets. One of Blackwood's hired guns dropped his rifle and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic as shadows seemed to pursue him from every direction. Another tried to climb onto the barn roof, only to find Storm waiting there, with the patient stillness of a natural predator who understood that fear was often more effective than violence. "Call them off!" Blackwood screamed at Elias, his civilized mask completely stripped away now. "Call them off or I'll—" His threat was cut short as Moon stepped out of the shadows behind him, her yellow eyes fixed on the man who'd been responsible for so much suffering. She didn't attack, didn't even growl. She simply stood there, letting him feel the weight of true predatory attention, the kind of focused intent that had once made humans huddle around fires and pray for dawn. Colonel Morrison and his marshals used the distraction to advance on the remaining gunmen, their federal authority backed now by an alliance that went beyond human law into something older and more fundamental. The battle was effectively over, though scattered shots continued to echo across the valley as the last of Blackwood's men tried to fight their way clear of enemies they couldn't see coming. The final confrontation came down to just two men facing each other across a barnyard littered with the debris of violence. Blackwood stood with his back against the barn wall, a derringer in his shaking hand, while Elias approached with the steady pace of someone who'd seen too much killing to take pleasure in it, but understood that some evils had to be stopped. "You don't understand what you've destroyed," Blackwood said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Those animals were part of something bigger, a network that extends across 3 territories. Killing me won't end it." "Maybe not," Elias replied, the Colt steady in his hand, "but it'll end your part in it." Around them, the pack had formed a loose circle, not threatening but present in the way that apex predators could be present, a reminder that humans weren't the only species capable of coordinated violence. Storm stood nearest to Elias, the big wolf's amber eyes fixed on Blackwood, with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its intensity. "You think you've won something here?" Blackwood's voice carried the bitter edge of a man who'd built his life on controlling others and couldn't accept that control, slipping away. "You've saved 3 animals. 3. There are dozens more in cages across the territory, hundreds being captured and shipped to buyers who'll make my operation look humane by comparison." Elias felt the weight of that truth, understanding that their victory here was just one battle in a war that had been going on since the first human decided that wild things existed only for his profit or entertainment. But battles mattered, especially to the individuals whose lives hung in the balance. "Then I guess we'll have to save them too." Colonel Morrison had moved into position behind Blackwood, his rifle trained on the animal trader's back. But he held his fire, recognizing that this moment belonged to the man who'd risked everything to honor a debt 15 years in the making. "Drop the gun, Blackwood," Morrison ordered. "It's over." Instead, Blackwood raised the derringer toward Elias. His face twisted with the kind of rage that came from years of treating living creatures like property, and suddenly discovering that some debts couldn't be paid with money or intimidation. The shot echoed across the valley, sharp and final as a judge's gavel. But it was Elias's Colt that had spoken, the heavy bullet taking Blackwood center mass and dropping him to the blood-soaked earth, where he'd planned to reclaim his stolen property. Storm approached the fallen man cautiously, sniffing at the still form, before raising his head to look at Elias with what might have been approval. The debt of violence had been paid, the account settled with the kind of finality that only death could provide. Doc Henley emerged from his shelter, medical bag in hand, moving to check on the wounded with the automatic response of someone whose calling transcended the boundaries of conflict. Sheriff Dalton was binding his deputy's shoulder wound while trying to maintain some semblance of legal authority over a situation that had clearly moved beyond civilian jurisdiction. "Elias," Morrison called, gesturing toward the federal marshals who were securing the surviving members of Blackwood's gang. "We're going to need statements from everyone involved. This case goes all the way to Washington now." But Elias was watching the wolves, seeing how they interacted with each other and with the humans who'd become their unlikely allies. Moon had moved to Scout's side, checking her offspring for injuries with the careful attention that marked good mothers in any species. The other wolves, Storm's extended family, drawn from whatever pack still roamed the high country, were already melting back into the wilderness from which they'd emerged. Only Storm, Moon, and Scout remained, the 3 animals whose rescue had started everything. They stood together in the morning sunlight, their coats gleaming with health that spoke of healing bodies and spirits that had survived the worst humans could inflict. "What happens to them now?" Doc asked, following Elias's gaze. It was the question that mattered most, the one that would determine whether their victory had any lasting meaning. The wolves were free, healed, and strong enough to survive in the wild. But they were also marked by their experience with humans, changed in ways that might make it difficult to return completely to the life they'd been born for. Storm made the decision for all of them. The big wolf approached Elias slowly, stopping just outside arm's reach to study the man who'd paid such a high price for their freedom. For a moment that seemed to stretch across years, they looked at each other, predator and human, wild and civilized, the saved and the savior. Then Storm did something that made Elias's throat tighten with emotion. The wolf dropped to his belly and crawled forward until he could press his nose against Elias's outstretched hand, the same gesture of submission and trust that wolves use to acknowledge their pack leaders. But this wasn't submission. This was recognition, acknowledgement that some bonds transcended species, that loyalty could flow both ways, and that the debt that had shaped 15 years of a man's life had finally been paid in full. Moon and Scout approached more cautiously, but they too offered the gesture of acceptance, touching their noses to Elias's hands before stepping back to stand with Storm. The pack was complete, the family reunited, and the circle that had begun in a mountain cave was finally closed. "They're choosing," Morrison observed quietly, "choosing to trust, choosing to stay connected even though they're free to go." The wolves turned as one toward the high country, their heads raised to catch scents that spoke of home and safety, and the kind of freedom that could only be found in places where humans rarely ventured. But before they departed, Storm looked back one final time, his amber eyes holding Elias's gaze with the weight of understanding that would last both their lifetimes. Then they were gone, flowing into the wilderness like shadows returning to their source, leaving behind only the memory of amber eyes and the knowledge that some debts, once paid, created bonds that could never be broken. 3 months later, Elias stood on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, coffee cup warming his hands as he watched the first light touch the mountain peaks. The events of that violent morning had changed, more than just his own life. They'd altered the entire character of the valley, creating ripples that spread far beyond the boundaries of his modest ranch. The federal investigation had uncovered an animal trafficking network that extended across half the Western Territories. Colonel Morrison's team had freed dozens of captured wolves, bears, and other wildlife from illegal operations, while the surviving members of Blackwood's organization faced federal charges that would keep them behind bars for decades. A small wooden cross marked the spot where Blackwood had fallen, not out of respect for the man, but as a reminder that some choices carried permanent consequences. Doc Henley had insisted on proper burial for all the dead, saying that even evil men deserved the dignity of earth and prayers, though he'd made it clear his sympathy didn't extend to mourning their passing. The wolf fang necklace still rested against Elias's chest, but its weight had changed. What had once been a burden of unpaid debt had transformed into something else, a talisman of connection, a reminder that the bonds between living things could transcend the boundaries that civilization tried to impose. Sam Morrison and the other ranchers had developed a grudging respect for Elias's judgment, their initial fear of the wolves replaced by understanding that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was surrendering to cruelty. The valley had closed ranks around its own, and the story of the man who'd saved 3 wolves had become the kind of legend that frontier communities used to define themselves. "You hear that?" Doc asked, riding up for his weekly visit and pausing to listen to a sound that drifted down from the high country. Elias smiled, setting down his coffee cup to focus on the distant howling that had become a regular part of the valley's evening chorus. The wolves had established territory in the mountains above his ranch, close enough that their voices carried on the wind, but far enough to avoid conflict with the ranchers below. "Storm's teaching Scout to hunt," he said, recognizing the specific cadence of the calls. "The young one's getting better at reading sign and working with the pack." They'd caught glimpses of the wolves over the past months, shadows moving through the timber, tracks beside the stream that ran through Elias's property. And once, a remarkable afternoon when Moon had brought Scout down to drink from his watering trough while Storm kept watch from the ridge above. The encounters were always brief, always on the wolves' terms, but they spoke of something that wildlife experts said was impossible: wild animals maintaining a connection with humans based on mutual respect rather than dependence or fear. The brass locket in his pocket had grown warm during each sighting, as if Sarah's spirit approved of the choices he'd made. "Colonel Morrison stopped by yesterday," Doc mentioned, dismounting to join Elias on the porch. "Says the territorial government is considering new laws about wildlife protection, partly based on what happened here." "That's so. Also says there's talk of establishing some kind of preserve in the high country, a place where wolves and other predators can live without interference." Doc poured himself coffee from the pot that always waited on the porch rail. "They want to name it after you." Elias shook his head firmly. "Those animals don't need my name attached to their freedom. Let them just be wild." A movement on the ridge above the ranch caught their attention, 3 shapes moving against the morning sky with the fluid grace that marked their kind. Even at distance, Elias could identify Storm's commanding presence, Moon's protective positioning relative to Scout, and the young wolf's growing confidence as he learned the skills that would ensure his survival. "They look good," Doc observed. "Healthy, strong. Think they'll stay in the area? For a while, maybe. Until Scout's old enough to find his own territory or starts his own pack." Elias fingered the bone whistle in his pocket, knowing that the connection between them would endure, regardless of geography. Wolves understand loyalty differently than humans do. It's not about staying in one place, it's about carrying the bond with you wherever you go. Now, the federal government had offered him a substantial reward for his role in breaking up the trafficking network, money that could have transformed his modest ranch into something grander. But Elias had declined, asking instead that the funds be used to support wildlife protection efforts across the territory. Some debts couldn't be paid with currency. Martha Webb had mentioned that new settlers were starting to arrive in the valley, drawn by stories of a place where different species could coexist peacefully. The narrative was becoming larger than the reality, but Elias didn't mind the embellishment. If it brought people who understood that civilization could accommodate wildness rather than destroy it, the transformation might be worth the attention. Sheriff Dalton had been re-elected by the largest margin in the county's history, his handling of the crisis having demonstrated the kind of leadership that frontier communities valued most. His deputy had recovered fully from his wound and married Martha's eldest daughter, creating the kind of happy endings that made difficult stories worth telling. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that reminded Elias of wolf eyes, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he'd made an impulsive decision at a livestock auction. The wolves he'd saved had returned the favor by saving something in him, the part of his spirit that had been diminished by years of trying to fit into a world that didn't quite understand what he'd learned in that mountain cave. A final howl drifted down from the ridge, this one clearly meant for human ears. Storm's voice, carrying the complex harmonies that spoke of gratitude, acknowledgement, and the kind of farewell that wasn't really goodbye, because the connection would endure regardless of time or distance. Elias raised his hand in a gesture that the wolf probably couldn't see but would somehow understand anyway. The debt was paid, the circle closed, the story complete except for the living that would come after. The brass locket warmed against his chest one final time as Sarah's memory seemed to whisper approval across the years. Some loves transcended species, some bonds survived death, and some debts could only be repaid by accepting that the greatest gift was the opportunity to serve something larger than oneself. The wolves had taught him that lesson in a mountain cave 15 years ago, and 3 desperate animals in auction cages had given him the chance to finally understand what it meant. As Doc Henley began discussing plans for the day, and the morning light transformed the valley into something golden and eternal, Elias Kane finally felt the peace that came from knowing he'd found his true north and followed it home.